again, everyone. My name is Jose Ramon Enriquez. I'm a PhD student in political economy and government here at Harvard. And I hope you have enjoyed the two panels so far. After this very interesting conversation that highlighted the relevance of women's political participation, now we will proceed with our next panel. Migration is one of the most important issues for North America. Migration is not only limited to flows of people, but incorporates exchanges of ideas and development of new identities. The main objective of the following conversation is to discuss from a range of disciplinary perspectives the complexities of defining, portraying, and understanding migration and the migrant experience. Based on each panelist's experiences, the conversation aims to elucidate the ways in which the public agenda on migration merges into migrant identities, activities, and dreams. Please let me introduce you to the panelists of today's conversation. And I will ask the panelists to turn on their cameras. Also, please, you can follow this conversation in Spanish if you go to translation. Y pueden usar la parte de traducción y seguir esta conversación en español usando el botón de traducción, de interpretación que está al fondo de su pantalla. And please, Professor Roberto Gonzales, Enrique, Julio, could you please turn on your cameras?
Hola, José Ramón. Perdón, soy Enrique Acevedo, solamente que el host tiene que permitirme que empiece el video porque no me permite todavía quitar el blog. Gracias.
Yeah, I'm in the same place.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
There you go. Hello, everyone.
Okay, there we go.
Great. Okay, so we're still waiting for Daniela, but I guess we can start with the introductions. So Enrique Acevedo, Enrique has been recognized as the voice of the Latino community by the Huffington Post and a global media leader by the World Economic Forum. Enrique Acevedo is a Mexican immigrant and a journalist based in the US. He's the first Latino correspondent in the 50-year history of the 20 Minutes brand. Prior to joining 60 Minutes Plus, he was the anchor of the award-winning Noticiero Univision late night edition. He holds a master's in journalism from Columbia University, and actually his work on Japan was featured as part of the school's centennial celebration in a book commemorating the best 100 stories in the last century. In 2019, he was a resident Pritzker Fellow at the University of Chicago Institute of Politics, where he taught a seminar about Latinx voters and the 2020 election. Acevedo is an Emmy Award winner and the recipient of the 2019 News Literacy Project's John S. Carroll Journalist of the Year Award for his contributions to the new literacy and identifying bias in news. He's now serving on the board of directors of the NLP. Thank you, Enrique, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Julio Salgado is a co-founder of Dreamers Adrift and the migrant storytelling manager for the Center for Cultural Power. His status as an undocumented queer artivist has fueled the contest of his visual art, which depict key individuals and the moments of the Dream Act and the migrants' rights movement. Undocumented students, organizers, and allies across the country have used Salgado's artwork to call attention to the migrant rights movement. Salgado is co-creator of the Disruptors Fellowship, an inaugural fellowship for emerging television writers of colors who identify as trans and or non-binary, disabled, undocumented, and or formerly undocumented immigrants.
Documentados o que son inmigrantes formalmente indocumentados.
His work has been displayed
Su
at the
trabajo
Oakland
ha
Museum,
sido mostrado en diferentes museos,
San Francisco MoMA, and Smithsonian.
conferencias como en el Smithsoniano, como el MoMA también.
Then we have Professor Roberto Gonzales. Roberto Gonzales is the professor of education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and director of the newly formed Immigration Initiative at Harvard, a university-wide effort aimed at advancing and promoting interdisciplinary scholarship and intellectual exchange around issues of immigration policy and immigrant communities. His research centers on contemporary processes of immigration and social inequality, and stems from theoretical interest at the interaction of race and ethnicity, immigration, and policy. Without further ado, please, Roberto, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for joining the conversation today.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jose Ramon. Greetings and welcome. It's an enormous thrill and honor to moderate this panel. It's a topic to which we could devote an entire conference. I teach a semester-long class, and we barely scratch the surface. But I'm honored to be with our panelists, and maybe one or two others will join us. This is a topic that has been front and center, not just these last 4 years, but for some time. Migration from Mexico to the United States is one of the longest and largest migrations in the world. Mexicans make up 25% of all immigrants in the United States today, and even a larger number of the broader Latinx community. It's a vibrant and diverse population. Half of the United States undocumented migrants are Mexican, but so are some of the largest shares of the United States high-skilled workforce. The US-Mexico border is the subject of heated political discussion on both sides, and the site of crossings, desires, violence, and spectacle. Meanwhile, migrants are settling into diverse communities across the United States and remaking our institutions, participating in community life, and reweaving the cultural fabric of neighborhoods, cities, and our country as a whole. We have little time, but we're blessed with an abundance of riches here, a real all-star lineup of panelists who will speak to some of these important issues. I want to start out, and I'll go first to Enrique, and then volley over to Julio. But to open up, much of what our public hears about migration is often told through one-dimensional stories that paint a multitude of different and diverse experiences in broad brushstrokes. Given this larger backdrop, and I would argue very limited set of scripts, has it been difficult to give a nuanced portrayal of migrants in your work, or is it really an open canvas for you? So Enrique.
Thank you, Roberto, and it's a pleasure to be here and sharing this conversation with Julio and with everyone who's with us today. It's extremely difficult, and it also depends on where I'm working. My previous job at Univision, we would focus on stories that spoke of our audience, and our audience was predominantly first and second generation immigrants in the United States. In the United States, the vast majority of them Latinos or Latin American descent, and it was just an easier environment to navigate. But if I was on Fox News talking to Tucker Carlson about immigration, then that was the nuance and context was certainly much more difficult to communicate. I think there's, for many years, there's a public narrative, a dominant narrative that conflates immigration with criminality, economic hardship, and even terrorism. And we can just actually, go back and look at the moment where this started happening in a more evident way here in the United States. I think 9/11 is a good starting point for us because two things happened right after the tragic events of September 11 in 2001. First of all, there was an immediate reaction to militarize the border, even though none of the terrorists had come through the US-Mexico border. And they all came through formal ports of entry with legal documents, visas or green cards. They had been here in many cases for a while. And all of them came from countries like Saudi Arabia and I think Yemen, amongst others. But the immediate reaction, and in a way, the understandable reaction, was to militarize the border, the US-Mexico border. That had an immediate effect in the circular movement of migrants, right? Before that, migrants would come from Mexico or other places in Latin America, Central America, and they would spend 6-8 months in the United States and go back to their countries, to their communities. There would be this constant, not just the remittances, but also the fact that there was this exchange, this constant exchange of going back and forth from the U.S. I think created a virtual cycle in many of these communities. Well, that of course stopped after the militarization of the border after 9/11. Many of these immigrants had to make the choice of, well, if I go back, as I've been doing for the past decade or more, I might not be able to return. So they started bringing their families into the U.S. and we had this resettlement and this realignment of everything, not just the demographics, but also the probably the rise of the modern Latinx vote as we know it after 9/11. The other thing that happened was the militarization of the border. Once very dynamic, prosperous border communities suffer through a narrative, I call it one of the biggest myths in American politics, the fact that the border needs to be secure when we have invested over $100 billion in the past decade, when we have over 20,000 Border Patrol agents, military-grade equipment and surveillance equipment, drones. The CBP Air Force is bigger than Brazil's Air Force, and just the combined budget of the U.S. Marshals, the FBI, the ATF, all of these law enforcement agencies, their combined budget is not even close to what CBP has. So that also created an environment of criminalization, and then with the anti-immigrant laws, the SB 1070 in Arizona, the SB 10 in Alabama, what we saw in places like Pennsylvania, where we had cases on the original anti-immigrant initiative, all of that incubated the sort of ethno-nationalism and the dehumanization, the criminalization of immigrants and immigration, especially from Latin America, that culminated in Trump's candidacy with this announcement where he launched saying what he said. I'm not going to repeat the words, we've heard him enough. And with his presidency and this very hostile context for immigrants and immigration. So I guess I went over my time, but the point was to see how this has gradually become what it's now not just a broken immigration system, but a sort of broken narrative around immigration. And I say broken narrative because it's not aligned with the principles and the values of a country that, as we know and as we've said 1,000 times, was founded on the shoulders of immigrants, and still, probably we've seen it more than ever through the pandemic, is supported on its essential workers, a large portion of them being migrants, many of them undocumented.
This is a great way to kick us off, Enrique. Thank you. Thank you for the providing such important, detailed, sweeping context. Now over to Julio. Can you talk about your work and in respect to kind of how you think about migrant communities, how you represent them, the kind of nuance, the very nuanced portrayals in your work?
Buenas tardes, Enrique and Roberto. Nice to have been in conversation with y'all, and I hope the other folks that come in. I'm excited to talk and hear from my friend's car, the internet. This is the only place that I can get internet right now. But yeah, I think about this all the time. I think about the ways in which people like myself, I'm undocumented, right? And as somebody who like I'm an artist, and I really I came of I don't know, you can say political age, like really get immersed into the movement when the Dream Act was really close to passing in 2010. And the Dream Act first got introduced in 2001, so it was like 9 years of like trying to push for this. But 2010 was a really pivotal year in terms of like the way that we were being represented in the media, because in 2010 a lot of us were like coming out and saying, I'm gonna speak for myself, I'm gonna tell my own story, I'm gonna there was this like movement called coming out of the shadows, right? And so as an artist and as somebody who wanted to make sure that those stories were being documented, I wanted to make sure that we included those stories, that those stories were being recorded from us, like from us, because yeah, like people were speaking on our behalf. And what that did a lot of the times was like, it always fell in a sort of like good immigrant versus bad immigrant narrative, right? Like we as dreamers, that we became known as, because of the Dream Act, sort of became the darlings of the movement, like this really good students, this really good immigrants. They are not the bad immigrants. They're not the ones who are like, stealing, Enrique mentions 9/11, they're not terrorists. They're not, so there was this sort of huge divide of narratives. And like, what about people in the middle? Like, what about the people whose stories we don't necessarily often, hear? And of course that had a huge impact, those narratives and those stories who were, I was very privileged in being able to tell my story as an undocumented student who was considered a dreamer, but really started thinking about whose stories are not being told, like, and because of that, and we end up having DACA, which, because the undocumented students were the ones who are seen like they're the ones who really need policy. We need to, my parents didn't qualify for DACA, right? And so I think, whose stories get told are very important, because all of a sudden there's this sort of like, you have to be a really good immigrant, and those are the stories that we want to see, right? Or, sort of the foxes, of the world, like, you have the stories of they're just here to steal your jobs and be criminals. And so I think that the a lot of the times within the news, in the news, there's not enough time. You need those 30-second clips, or that's why I love having conversations like this, because you get to like get more into it, but there's not enough time to tell like full stories. And so as an artist, I try to go in there and sort of portray like people, like my parent, like for me, it starts with my family, my parents, like what's their story, what kind of what are some of the things that I'm not seeing in the media, being portrayed. Me being queer, me being, part of the LGBT community. I remember in the early 2010s, when we were told, don't talk about the gay stuff, like talk about, focus on being, on the immigrant stories. And it was just like, that's just one example of like the complex stories that immigrants, the lived experience that we have.
Yeah, this is really great. I remember actually maybe 10 years or so ago, when Julio, when I think that you were still at Long Beach, having a very similar conversation. But I want to ask you a follow-up question. and my apologies if I cut you off. I heard a silence, so I wanted to I wanted to fill the silence, but please keep going. So you know, scholars like me have spent a lot of time thinking about migration and how it shapes identity. And you know, people argue that identity is shaped by both origins and destinies, from where you're from and also where you end up, by who you're with, who you live with, who's in your community, what you do, who you are, et cetera, et cetera. Some also suggest that migration is shaping the identities of places. It's you know, people talk about assimilation, and assimilating to U.S. culture, it looks very different if you're in New York City, if you're in Southern California, even Northern California, in Miami, looks totally different. How is your work in conversation with questions of identity?
Well, I think that's a big thing that, you know, I go back to this like good immigrant versus bad immigrant. I think for many years, the narrative that me as an undocumented immigrant who I came here in 1995, you know, to California, you know, right after, you know, Prop 187, you know, we came into California in a very anti-immigrant, you know, environment. And so, you know, that really shaped my parents sort of like, you know, of course, being afraid and being like super quiet and being careful, like, do not tell anybody you're undocumented. Don't tell, you know, and strive for being good, for being, you know, going to school, do your thing, right? And you know, and I think that narrative really was the thing that a lot of us were saying. You know, we were trying to convince a whole country, we're trying to pass the DREAM Act because we're just here to go to school. We're just here, you know, we're here to do the thing. You know, we're Americans. You know, like we are the dream. We are the thing that that we are, you know, we're constantly told to do. And so what I've sort of come to now, the realization is that no matter how much I try to say I'm a good person, I'm a good, you know, like, you know, we need to change policy. You know, people migrate not because they wake up one day and say, you know what, I'm gonna try a different country and see what happens. Like, it doesn't work like that, right? And so but no matter how much I try, there's still people who like think that I'm a criminal, who don't see my human, like me being a human. And so like I'm tired of trying to convince people of my humanity. So where I'm at right now, it's like I'm going to create art, and I'm going to create narratives, and I'm going to focus on narratives that uplift the good things and the things that bring us joy as immigrants, right? Like it's not all pain all the time. Well, it's part of it, but it's, you know, I'm happy. I'm a happy person. You know, I'm a happy, complex person, and those things are not are often lost in this like trying to convince people that we're good immigrants, we're good people. I don't know if that answered the question, but like, you know, like that's kind of where I'm at, where I've gone from trying to assimilate and be a good immigrant, a good thing, you know, trying to give back to like, we just saw 4 years of people not caring about, you know, what I have to offer. They should see me as a criminal, and period. You know, and I'm not interested in trying to change people's mind anymore, because I'm tired. I just wanna create art. I just wanna be an artist, and, you know, allowed to be flawed, allowed to, you know, and I think through, you know, like through art, I think I'm able to do that.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. I think really powerful. Julio, thank you.
If I may, Roberto,
Yeah,
listening
absolutely.
to Julio, I realized I made a common mistake among journalists, that we tend to focus on the negative aspect of things, and I should have said a pivotal point in understanding immigration, especially here in the U.S., was the Dreamer movement. I think for a long time we understood that immigrants, undocumented immigrants in the U.S. lived, um, you know, in the shadows. That was a term that was commonly used, and dreamers really uh, um, shattered that perception and came out and were saying we're undocumented and unafraid. They understood how politics work. They understand how politics work. They get the work done, and they get the work done for themselves and for their community, their parents, their families, but beyond their immediate keen. And so I think it's very important to also take that into account to understand where our national conversation around immigration is right now, because it wouldn't be in the same place, nearly in the same place, without this activism, this incredible successful political engagement from the community known as Dreamers. And I think that's a very positive development in this timeline that we were trying to work around the issue of immigration. And the other part, the identity part, I find it fascinating. I just interviewed J Balvin in LA last week for a piece I'm doing, a profile for 60 Minutes. And he said something that I think is great, and that it speaks to the youth movement within the immigration community. By the way, he first came to the US as an undocumented worker to paint houses in Florida. But my point is, he says that for many years, Latin artists were trying to assimilate or cross over into mainstream by singing in English or trying to be more like their English language counterparts. And that his dream now was to bring mainstream into Latin music and into our world. And I think that's what's been missing in this conversation about assimilation and identity. Spanish is an American language, right? That's no secret. It was spoken in half of the country before English was. Everything about who we are as a culture is part of this nation's DNA, more so than probably any other group, ethnic group, culture, community, whatever we want to call it. It's in the food, it's in the names of cities and states, and it's in just, when we say essential workers, it's not just that they're indispensable to our economic well-being or to the supply chain. They're essentially in our essence. The American essence is made up of all the contributions that this Latinx community and culture has added to its DNA. So I think it's fascinating that a place like Miami, for example, when you were saying not just the individual identity, but the identity of any given place or city, that Miami is really a city apart from the rest of the US, where it's hard to get around if you don't speak Spanish. It's frustrating for people that don't speak Spanish, especially now that we've had all this migration from New York and California, and people are resettling here in Florida. They find that they just can't go get coffee. They need to understand how cafecito is made, and they need to ask for their coffee in Spanish. I'm not advocating for that, but I'm saying that's what it looks like when two cultures borrow from each other, where two cultures learn from each other, and two cultures accept the fact that they're complementing each other and not in this tension of, do I accept you here? Do you stay there? It's not about geographic lines as much as it is about history and the idea of Huntington back in the time that Latinos were not going to assimilate because we're not going to be part of the melting pot because we were too close to home and we didn't speak the language. But that's the point. The melting pot has evolved and it's now more of a pozole or an ajiaco or birria, whatever you want to call it. And everyone, it's in there and everyone likes it. And it's just a little more spicy. That's I think the point I wanted to make.
Enrique, you're making me hungry.
And I mean,
so yeah, Julio, please.
No, I was just gonna say. I mean, I just I one of the things that I think Enrique mentions, that like making the mistake of like focusing on certain things. I think it's good to focus on all the things. I think when there's you know, when there's like, I've had conversations, I'll just be blunt, you know, like I've had conversations with journalists where, you know, like they'll ask me a question, like, tell me about your migration story. And, you know, like the constant focus on, you know, like the pain, or like, and I want to talk about like, oh, you know, like, let me tell you about, you know, my group of, you know, I'm in LA, you know, a group of undocumented folks who started a nightlife scene, you know, and we look to, you know, you know, when Trump got elected, a bunch of us went out and partied and were with each other, because sometimes you need to be community. But that's not a story that, no, I want to see you cry and tell me you're scared because Trump got elected. It's like, yeah, sure, we, you know, deportation, it's always in the back of my mind. I have DACA, but like, I also, you know, do, like, you know, a lot of us do other things that, you know, like to cope with those things. But the fact that many journalists just want to focus, and I study journalism. I'm, you know, I was a journalism major, so like I know the you know, the wanting to go for that story, right? That you know, it just makes sense politically, you know, like, you know, you must be suffering, yes, but we're more complex than that, you know, we're more than our suffering. And so, you know, but I definitely appreciate, you know, like journalists who like do like a follow-up, a follow-up on the, you know, like how are you, you know, ethically telling the stories of like, you know, did you just like interview this family who, you know, suffer, you know, like what is the follow-up, right? And so I think, you know, like I'm so happy that there's more like sons of immigrant, or sons and daughters of immigrants, and like immigrants themselves who are journalists, and have that, you know, that they're telling, you know, other stories, because they're familiar with that, you know, with the community.
This is so great. Just to give you an example of what Julio is saying, and to admit my own blame in this. I don't know if you remember back in, what was it, 2016, there was a Democratic presidential debate organized by Univision, and I was in charge of the audience's questions. And I had Lucia Kieg, an undocumented immigrant from Guatemala. She had, I think, 4 or 5 kids. They were all born here in the US, and their father had been recently deported. And we had a moment, right there on national TV. I told her to ask her question. I translated the question to Bernie Sanders and Senator Clinton, um, and then when they started replying to her question, I realized that she didn't have a simultaneous translation. So I started translating the question in her ear, something we all have done, like Roberto, Julio, everyone probably joining us on this call. We've all done that, right? Like translate from Spanish to English or the other way around. So that was, people, when they saw it on national TV here in the US, they're sort of reacting like, oh my God, this is such a special moment. Blah, blah, blah. What I want to say is that then I had someone else from the audience, this incredibly accomplished young immigrant who spoke both English and Spanish, and probably French and German too. And she was, I think, studying engineering, and just like a completely different story from Lucia Kiek's. But my producers, like in my ear, were saying, translate the question for her. And like, she can do that herself. I mean, it's like you started by asking us about nuance and really combating this unidimensional narrative of what immigration is and what undocumented immigration, and then immediately we say undocumented immigration or immigration from Mexico. Yes, immigration from Mexico is 25% of of the entire immigrant community in the U.S., a larger portion of the Latinx immigrant population, but there's a very complex and diverse set of issues and topics that come with immigration. So it's a recognition of how sometimes we, not just for journalistic purposes or not even journalistic purpose, I would say for television or whatever medium you work on, we tend to try to bring the story back to this one dimension of undocumented immigration, suffering, and yes, we should not forget about that. that's a big component of trying to bring light and provide a voice for this community that sometimes, leaves a painful and complicated story. But there's so much more about immigration, and if we want to see that reflected in a larger national narrative, we should start by creating that ourselves and being very careful of the words we use and the realities we create through those words.
Yeah, it's such a challenge. I think, Julio mentioned earlier the 30-second soundbite, that we're really kind of limited to telling stories within the soundbite, and the very, very short attention span of our consciousness with social media and moving from one thing to another. It becomes very difficult, yet very critical, to have these nuanced stories, to move beyond these one-dimensional caricatures. So by 2050, United States is going to be, will have the largest Spanish-speaking population in the world. And I hear that Daniela will be joining us soon, any minute. But let's start this question. What is your perspective, and either of you, on the future of Latinx identity in the U.S.? What does that look like? Are people, as Scholar says, are Latinx communities fading to whiteness? Are we, because of entrenched politics, are we building up walls within communities? And how might the presence of a broad and diverse, vibrant Latinx community be changing the places where Latinos reside?
I'll go first, and I'll be brief because I've talked a lot and I want to hear what Julio has to say, because I think he's more interesting voice than I am. But I would just say yes to all of that, Roberto. We're a little bit of everything. There's a little bit of truth in everything that you just said about the Latinx community. And what I found the most fascinating is the fact that we don't agree on a term to define ourselves, right? Even if I say Latinx, we're going to have a lot of people saying, "Oh, come on, that's not grammatically correct. Estás matando el español con el uso de la ex." And that's fine. I don't mind people don't liking the term Latinx. I use it because I think it's just more inclusive, and when I talk to people, I want everyone to feel welcome and included in the conversation. That's just me. But I get that people don't feel comfortable using it for whatever reason. That's fine. But my point with this is just saying, we're such a complex and rich and diverse community that this is an ongoing fluid conversation. Our identity is not a set thing right now. It's still evolving, and we're all contributing to that with conversations like the one we're having, and with our everyday lives, and with my interaction with people older than me from different backgrounds, national origins, and even ways of experiencing Spanish and our Latinx culture, wherever that is, because it's so different and diverse, through the interactions with my kids who were born here, and who, sometimes, they say they're Mexican before, and they're one's 4, the other one's 2, but if you ask them, it's like, ¿de dónde eres? Mexicano. ¿Y dónde vives? In Miami. So, and so that it's a fluid conversation. And I think it's great that we have not agreed on a label, and that we are, constantly debating any label that tries to sort of define and just to stop the conversation on how our identity keeps evolving. Now I'll be quiet.
Yeah, so I see Daniela is here now, so I want to bring in Daniela. As people know, Daniela Soto-Innes, chef, James Beard Rising Star Award winner, world's best female chef. New York Times called her one of the most exciting chefs working today, and Food and Wine deemed her one of the world's best chefs. Daniela, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Hola. Perdón por el problema técnico.
So we're just I think that kind of where we've landed in this conversation. It's been a really great conversation. But we're talking about Latinx culture and within the very near future, Latinos, Latinx community in the United States will make up the largest Spanish-speaking population in the world. And so from your vantage point as a chef, as one of the best, and your acclaimed restaurants, how are what are your perspectives on the future of Latinx identity in the U.S., but also in Mexico, and how is that changing the places where Latinos reside?
Hola a todos, first of all. Sorry I'm late, guys. I had a problem with the times. Thank you so much for inviting me. But jumping into this conversation, I think Latinos are just getting, we're just getting stronger. And the fact that we have more chefs, young chefs, older chefs that represents, that we go back to our country and we represent so strongly, our roots so strongly, and having people from all over the world follow us, that makes, I feel like that's why the impact of Latinos is going to be just growing bigger and bigger and growing without like nonstop. I think when I first started Cosme, I had 3 cooks and no dishwasher. Nobody wanted to work with a woman that was young, and everybody was just like, oh no, we want to work with that Mexican chef that looks like a chef. And I'm just like, okay, I'm just going to continue working every day. I used to sleep in the kitchen like for maybe 3 months. And then the New York Times recognized us, and after that, we couldn't keep up with the amount of resumes that we had. But 10% of those resumes were from Latinos. The other resumes were from people from all over the world. And the more we got recognized of what we were doing, how we were doing it, why we were doing it, it flipped to 90% of the resumes were from Latinos. And that was really beautiful to see. And 6-7 years later, now we have maybe 15 people from ex-cooks or ex-chefs from that kitchen that have their own restaurants now. And they're all Latinos. And even people like that are from Russia, Japan, are cooking now Mexican food, which is like really interesting, because first people didn't even want to work in a Mexican restaurant, because why would they do that? They have 11 Madison Park, La Bernardin, and all these 3-star French restaurants or American restaurants that have a lot more credibility than a Mexican restaurant at the time. And now everyone wants to make their own tortillas. Everyone wants to learn where the corn comes from. Everyone wants to travel to Mexico. We'll go to Oaxaca, Mexico City, Baja California. So it's just like growing. And I think the coolest thing is that I was just in Mexico for a month and doing this trip, and all the students were like, we want to travel more in our country before we go to another country and represent our country again. So I think what we have to do is instill our culture and not forget, where we're from and the varieties of the richness of our countries. And I think if we do that, then, we just won't stop evolving and representing ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful, and I think that what you're also saying is that in very distinct and important ways, culture is not static. And it's being remade, and Mexican cuisine is being remade. How is it? I guess how does it feel to be really kind of helping to drive this and pioneer this kind of part of this new wave of Mexican cuisine?
Well, there's a lot more to learn always. I think, like by leading or by being part of the pioneers that continue, doing this, is just never stop learning and continue of always being curious and continue like traveling to your country, being proud of your country, getting to know all the incredible chefs from Mexico or from like other Latino places, and just instead of, you know, being like, this is my kitchen and this is what I represent on, sorry. Instead of thinking this is just what I do and this is it, is being more curious about what other chefs are doing and what's happening in other kitchens and what's happening in other cultures, because that's the only way that, you know, your mind gets richer, when you like really see everything that is happening around you.
Yeah, that's really great. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here and really, moreover, for really revolutionizing Mexican cuisine. I don't know what's happening here. The hour really flies by fast, and we've got about 12 or so minutes, and there are many questions from audience members. So I want to go to policy right now, and I want to ask the panelists, you know, what are your opinions? This is the kind of version of a question that was asked. What are your opinions about Biden's proposed immigration policies with respect to kind of broader 11 million or so people who are undocumented, but also for undocumented young people, aka dreamers? Should we be optimistic about his chances? You know, I think before 2016, some really smart people I knew were giving 15 to 20-year projections about immigration reform. I don't know how the last 4 years have changed the calculus for really moving something forward, but are you optimistic or not? What do you all think are the chances of passing some sort of immigration reform?
¿A quién le dicen? A Julio. Dale, Julio.
Daniela. No, I okay. So I mean, I have so many thoughts on this, but I'll try to be super short. I graduated high school in 2001. So I'm that was the first year that the Dream Act was introduced, right? And so I've been doing this for like 20 years, and trying to push for us. And I'm still undocumented, right? I have DACA, but we know that sort of, was still, it's still, could be taken away, right? And so, my mom's name is Esperanza, and so like I am a big believer of like lo último que se pierde es la esperanza, and so I have my beliefs are firm in that, right? Like I'm hopeful, but I'm also realistic, like I'm realistic in terms of like there's this idea that the Democrats are going to come and save us, that the Republicans are the bad guys. And I just think politics overall, like are very complex, but at the same time, very like, it's driven by economics, and it's driven by the fact that as immigrants, we're still seen as bodies that, are, it's our work, it's worth it, but like, we appreciate what Daniela's doing, we appreciate like when the culture is being appreciated. It's like, changing that anti-migrant culture is the one thing that I'm like, as an artist, I want to focus on, because I do believe that, culture is always ahead, like culture is like always ahead in like changing that, while the Dream Act hasn't changed or didn't pass, even though it was reintroduced again in February, as undocumented immigrants, we gain a lot of cultural power. The fact that I'm here talking to y'all and saying I'm undocumented, it's a huge cultural shift. And so I think, like for me, I hope that something happens. I am a little bit on the jaded side, but I am hopeful still.
And just, I know there's a question about specifically about President Biden's immigration policy, and I tried to answer it already on the Q&A, but I would say I think it has two main objectives. The first one is to sort of amend or correct the anti-immigrant sentiment of some of the Trump-era policies in refugees, asylum seeking, and also in both undocumented and documented immigration. And the other part and the other main objective, I think it's reforming our immigration. Those are my kids crying if you hear any background noise, and they will show up any minute and try to just climb on the computer, but I'm sorry about that. The other main objective, I think, was to reform and modernize the immigration system. So not only it reflects our values better, but also takes advantage of the opportunities that the future will bring with immigration. A big part of why this country and this economy keeps growing, it's because of immigration. So sort of fix the broken rules so we can take more and better advantage of that. And at the same time, we're better prepared to deal with the challenges that immigration will bring in the future, like climate refugees, for example, or other challenges that inevitably will catch up to us. And if we have a more modern working immigration system, we'll just be better equipped to deal with those. I'm optimistic about where the administration wants to go. I just heard Senator Padilla, the first ever Latino to represent California in the Senate, say that essential workers need a path to citizenship, and that would be the least we could do to honor the fact that they've been essential, not just through the pandemic, but especially through these very dark times. And if they don't get it done through the legislative process, then do it through reconciliation. The thing is that the vast majority of us, not just us Latinos, I think us, the people in the US support immigration reform, are against family separation, are against the border wall, support a more humane refugee policy. Like there's, I think, overwhelming public support for this. And if our democracy is not capable of reflecting this overwhelming public support for immigrants' rights and for immigration reform, then we need to start looking at the system and saying, well, what's the point? How do we get those in Congress to react? Well, not just through the stories of suffering, like Julio was saying, through the stories that emphasize the contributions, the economic, social, political, cultural contributions of immigrants. What better moment to do that than on the coattails of a pandemic where frontline essential workers, a vast majority of them immigrants, carry the country on their backs. There's no better moment and no better way to illustrate why this is needed than the crisis we just went through. We were overrepresented in the infection rates, in the death rates. We were overrepresented in the health and economic impact of this crisis. We're underrepresented in vaccination, and we're underrepresented in sort of government assistance to businesses and people who lost their incomes. Despite of that, all of these people have been essential to the country.
Sorry,
yeah, sorry, I keep going.
No, my apologies. We've got about 5 minutes, and so I guess if we want to move that needle, if we want to really achieve social justice, immigration reform, better quality of life for Latinx community, for Mexicans on both sides of the border, for immigrants, what are the winning arguments, or what are the winning campaigns? What are the winning images, slogans, depictions? What do we need to be saying?
I would just say focusing on the yeses. We focus a lot on the no's. I don't mean to give that, but just focusing on what are the things that that we want, the yeses. We are used to saying no deportations, no kids in cages, and that's real. But what are the yeses? What are the wants that we need? And that Enrique just said well, yes, celebrate us, as people who, work as essential workers. My father was directly affected, by this as an undocumented immigrant. And, he ended up really bad, and so how are we, saying yes to a lot of the things that we need, as immigrant community.
That's really great. Thank you, Julio. Daniela, are you still with us? Enrique.
No, yeah, I mean, I would say again, as someone who works with words, I always say that words create realities, and we have to take ownership of our own narrative. And that's what I try to do. I always use this example. During the 2016 election, we saw that there was this reckoning and soul searching after Trump got elected about how the media, and I hate that term because it groups many things, many different things, missed the story of the Rust Belt and the blue collar workers in that part of the country, and how we needed to diversify our newsrooms to reflect these points of view and reflect these rural communities and their struggles, their economic anxieties and demographic frustrations. Demographic frustrations being an elegant concept to say racism, but I then would say the same about the border in the past election. We were all having a conversation about the US-Mexico border. We all have a conversation about the US-Mexico border, and just very few people have been to the border or understand the border. Even worse, we rarely hear from people, from the border. And so I would bring them into the conversation and incorporate their points of view into our conversation. I can't think of a better way to changing and recapturing ownership of the narrative just by involving the people who are directly involved. And that's probably the biggest thing I try to do with my stories. Not just to be a voice for anyone, but to provide a voice for people to tell their own stories. And I think we should see more of that.
So we're almost out of time, about 1 or 2 minutes left. Any last words of advice? We've got many students who are part of this conference. We've got many leaders, aspiring leaders. Any words of advice? Any parting words of advice? Yeah, Julio, go for it.
I would just say, again, right, as an artist who happens to be undocumented and queer, like those things have informed my work. I've, continued to focus on making art. Somebody asked in there, when I started making art. I've been making art since I was a little kid. Shameless plug, I just released a short documentary called My Name is Julio that you can find on YouTube that, kind of takes me on this journey as an undocumented person who, I ended up in this Smithsonian as an undocumented artist. Like, that's a big deal, right? And so for me, I think, again, right, focusing on that thing, and that's just my story. That's just one story, but like focusing on that thing that you want to do, like people are going to tell you, no, I'm here to tell you as an immigrant who like has work, all the jobs, it is possible, but just keep doing it. It sounds so cliche, but keep.
And I would just add, don't try to, in journalism, now that I'm part of a brand that's been around for more than 50 years, I tried at the beginning to fit into that mold, to hide my Mexican accent, to sort of go for stories outside of what I do, my stronghold, which is covering the border, immigration, or Latin America. And I try to be a version of myself that was closer to what I've seen on 60 Minutes for the past 50 years. And Bill Owens, the head of 60 Minutes, the first thing he said is like, "What are you doing? I didn't hire you for that. I hired you because of who you are and what you bring to the table." And that accent and that unique context and point of view about issues like immigration, but also about culture and politics and just life in general. That's what we need. And so if my experience is useful for anyone who's listening, especially right now that you're in school, in grad school, your unique experience, your individuality is much more valuable than what you think you have to fit into, or any mold that Harvard or any other institution or company or wherever you end up working for, even whatever you do, just make sure you bring your own voice and you develop your own your own ideas, and be unapologetic about it, and be brave about sharing those with the rest of us.
Yeah, very, very well said. I think that we've lost Daniela, but Julio, Enrique, thank you so much for your words and your work, very enriching. Thanks for making time.
Thank you for having us. Thank
A
you.
pleasure. Gusto, Julio. Abrazo.
Igualmente.